Hi, men. Welcome to day 10 of this body transformation audio seminar. And today we are talking about protein. Protein. Sex, weights, and protein shakes. Am I right, man? Don't know how much you need, but you need more, right? Well, let's see. Protein in the Greek means of first importance. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of truth there, but you may not need as much as you think. And I should start by saying right now that this entire lesson today assumes that you are training strictly to look better, to build muscle and to lose fat. You're not a competitive athlete. You're not a collegiate athlete. You're not performing in any regular endurance, anaerobics, or anything like that. You're just training to build muscle, to lose fat, and to look good naked. And the reason I say that is athletes may need more protein because, one, they just perform significantly more activity than the average individual. So their caloric requirements are generally going to be higher, and some of that protein that they need will also be used to fuel those activities. But also due to the increased activity, and sometimes depending on the nature of that, they might need more protein to try and offset some larger degrees of muscle breakdown from some of that activity. So let's do a little protein math. Let's just think about 1 pound of muscle. 1 pound of muscle is about 78% water, so only about 22% protein in a pound of muscle. A pound of muscle is, therefore, by doing the math, only about 100 grams of protein. There are 453 grams in a pound times 0.22 gives you just under 100 grams of protein in 1 pound of muscle. So let's assume you wanted to gain 10 pounds of muscle in a year, which I think is an amount that most people who perform weight training would be very happy to have if they were able to put on 10 lean pounds of muscle in a year. You'd only need about 1,000 additional grams of protein above maintenance. Now this comes out to just under 3 grams of protein a day above maintenance. So you don't need exorbitant amounts of protein in your diet. For comparison, the National Institute of Health for the U.S. government maintains a minimum RDA, and the RDA is the amount of a certain macro and micronutrient that is recommended that will keep 97.5% of people who eat that amount from suffering from a deficiency or having any ailments because of a deficiency. So the National Institute of Health recommends a minimum RDA of 56 grams a day of protein for the average size male. And again, this is the amount that's going to keep 97.5% of men healthy and from losing muscle. Now, the NIH's actual recommendations are 0.8 grams per kilogram. So for me at 230 pounds, that comes out to 83 grams a day of protein. That's it. But I get it, right? We're all bros. We hit the gym hard. We're doing these unbelievably tough workouts. We're pushing ourselves. We're pushing our bodies. We're breaking down that muscle. We need to rebuild that muscle. So surely we need more, right? Well, there's 2 articles I really enjoy, and you should Google these. The first one is The Ultimate Guide to Protein Synthesis, or it might be called The Ultimate Guide to Muscle Protein Synthesis. And the other website you're going to want to look for, Bayesian Bodybuilding, has a great article called The Myth of 1 gram per pound of protein. Now, both this article and this website both say that most weight training individuals can only utilize about 0.64 grams per pound of body weight of protein, with very little benefit to eating more. So for me at 230 pounds, this comes out to be about 150 grams of protein a day. Is about the max that's been demonstrated through numerous studies that I can utilize just being an average weight training individual who wants to build muscle, lose fat, not really being an athlete. So I'll sum up my view on protein as follows. Too much isn't really a thing, but too little definitely is. You want to make sure you're eating enough protein so you don't break down muscle. And for most Americans, that's really not going to be a problem. We eat quite a bit of protein compared to most countries. On the other end, if you're constantly slamming protein shakes, protein is very thermogenic, more so than fat, more so than carbohydrates. About 20% of all the calories in the protein you eat gets used just to break down that protein so it can be utilized. So eating more protein than you need is essentially just wasteful. Again, to build 10 pounds of muscle in a year, presuming your weight training is intense enough, you only need about 3 grams a day above maintenance. That'll be 10 pounds in a year. You don't need 20 to 30 grams of protein every 2 to 3 hours. You don't need to slam that protein shake immediately the second you get your workout done. Again, if you're just training to look better naked. If you're an athlete, it might be different. It may be more ideal to get protein every 2 to 3 hours, but the gap between pretty good results and optimal results is not as far off as you may think. So think about it. People have been building larger amounts of muscle or larger than normal amounts of muscle for well over 50 years now, at least as long as bodybuilding has been around. But historically, our ancestors, and going back to the Greeks and even before them, there were very heavily muscled individuals that did not eat some of these crazy amounts of protein and didn't have the training equipment that we have today. So there's a lot more that goes into building muscle than protein. Building muscle is a stimulus response mechanism. The stimulus is the weight training. You go into the gym and simply perform what nature requires for the compensatory response of stronger, bigger muscles. And the actual growth comes from recovery. It comes from giving your body the nutrients it needs and the time it needs to fully rest, fully recover, and grow. And you don't need a lot of protein for that to happen. In the 70s, some of the bigger bodybuilders, the Arnold Schwarzenegger, he was about 235 pounds at, I think, one of his biggest, 6'1", 235 pounds. And there were a number of bodybuilders back then that won the Mr. Olympia under 200 pounds. Frank Zane, for example, Franco Columbu, under 200 pounds. And back then in the 70s, if you look at Arnold's Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding, back then he ate only about 1 gram per pound of body weight. So Arnold, being one of the biggest Mr. Olympias, being someone that trained 2 to 3 hours a day, 6 days a week, probably with more intensity than you and I do, only needed 1 gram per pound of body weight. Now, granted, he had anabolic steroids, and they all did back then, but those anabolic steroids also increase the amount of protein you can absorb. So he was definitely getting enough protein to fuel some very lengthy, very intense workouts at only, again, 1 gram per pound of body weight. So if I had to come up with a list of rules in terms of importance for protein, it would be as follows. And the first rule I would recommend, and pretty much the only rule I would recommend, is make sure you're eating more than 100 grams of protein a day. If you're getting that, you're getting enough. Even in a caloric deficit, even if you're trying to lose fat, you're not going to lose that muscle, provided your workouts are sufficiently intense. If you want more protein, eat more protein. Be my guest. You're probably not going to do much harm, if any harm. So there's a large gap after that first rule. Rule number 1, eat at least 100 grams of protein a day. Very, very, very large gap. And then number 2, space out some of that protein through the rest of the day. And it's a little bit more ideal if you have that protein scattered across a few meals, maybe a few snacks instead of, 1 or 2 big meals a day, but it's really not that important. The small intestine, interestingly enough, can actually retain a lot of amino acids from protein in the villi and release them into the bloodstream as necessary. So if you eat this giant, 2-pound steak, right, you certainly can't utilize all of that protein in one sitting, but the body has mechanisms that are in place as we've evolved that will hold on to a lot of those amino acids until they're needed, while the body processes everything that it's not able to absorb. And then if you want to do other things like if you want to do some kind of nutrient timing, I don't really agree with it. I don't think it's that big of a deal. But be my guest. You're really not going to do any harm. The most important rule is just make sure you're eating enough. And it's really not as much as you may think. Again, I wouldn't really worry about nutrient timing. And the reason for that is recovery is a 24-hour process. It's happening from the second you finish that first set until the muscle is fully recovered. And for most food that you eat, if you eat a big meal, let's just say a balanced meal, proteins, carbs, fats, fiber, all the macro and micronutrients, depending on the contents of that meal, it takes 12 to approximately 24 hours for that entire meal to be digested and go from your mouth to out the other end and be totally removed from the body. There's a very lengthy process in which your body strips away different nutrients at different points in the digestive tract before it finally passes everything. So if the food that you eat takes 12 to 24 hours in a meal, you're not going to be going these long periods of time without protein in your system. You really shouldn't worry about losing muscle. You shouldn't worry about having to eat protein every 2 to 3 hours. Again, those articles are out there, and I highly recommend you read it. The Ultimate Guide to Muscle Protein Synthesis and Bayes in Bodybuilding's The Myth of 1 gram per pound of body weight. Very, very research-backed, very interesting. And then just in my own experience with myself as a primary test subject and also all the clients I work with, trust me, if you're doing things right with your workout, if you're getting enough recovery, you do not need tons of protein. If you want more, go for it. But you do not need as much as you probably think you do. That's it for today, guys. Thanks for listening. I will talk to you tomorrow.